Thank you. Just a little bigger group. Ray Smith told me, oh, we'll have a few guys here for lunch, and so it's a little bigger than I was expecting, but I'm glad to see you all here. And I know you're on your lunchtime, so I'm going to try and do this fairly briskly, but it's a little, there's a lot here. So what I'm going to do is ask you to hold questions until I'm done if you want to ask questions. Hopefully your lunchtime will be out and you'll have to go and I won't have to answer any of them, but we'll do our best. I presented here once before. I presented over at the American Museum of Science and Energy. Is that right? Yeah. I presented at a lot of museums lately. And met Ray, and he said, you know, if you ever come back, I'd like to give you a tour of Y12. And I said, oh, that'd be wonderful. Well, my daughter's going to school in Virginia, so I called him up and said, we're on our way from Houston to Virginia, and I'm coming through. Is that tour offer still good? And he said, yeah, sure. So he set it up, and I just spent the morning having just a fascinating tour, looking at your history. Down there looking at the calutrons and all the stuff, and it's enormous. I hope you appreciate it the way some of us who don't get to be in it, immersed in it like you do, and that where you have opportunities, you take a chance to look at it. Now, I have to think of all the things I got to tell you before I start, because there's a few things. Number one is I'm going to create a bunch of different piles of information, and hopefully they'll link together as we go along. And that's why I ask you to hold questions so we don't kind of get sidetracked or go down rat holes that are going to be dealt with later. The other thing is you're going to find, if you know what the topic of the presentation or what the title of the book is Critical Mass. The subtitle is How Nazi Germany Surrendered Enriched Uranium for the United States Atomic Bomb. Now, obviously, that's not part of the traditional history, and there's probably a lot of people here going, no way. Okay, that was my first reaction, too. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the documents. Almost every document I'm going to show you, there are one or two exceptions that aren't primary documentation that will be published from an eyewitness account or something like that. Almost everything I'm going to show you are actual primary source documents on Y12 or the Manhattan Project or some out of the Navy side of that. I'm going to go through and I'll tell you, I'm talking about the traditional history now, and then I'll tell you when I'm breaking from the traditional history, so you'll understand where the differences are and what you need to focus on to challenge me if that's what you want to do. And there'll probably be some that want to do that. Just so you know, I've given this presentation obviously here once previously at Oak Ridge at the museum. I've given it twice at Los Alamos. I gave it just on the 16th of this month at the National Atomic Museum. So far I'm still alive and kicking, although every time I do it it's terrifying. So anyway, let's get started. Got to put my eyes on here. We focused? Oh, that's pretty good. Actually on May 12th of 1945, which is 4 days after VE Day, after the surrender of Germany. I'm sorry, I'm going to be walking around in front of you, aren't I? I pace, so you might want to move I'll never remember to stay out of your way. A radio signal was received. It was open. It wasn't coded or anything, and it basically said, this is U-boat U-234. We're here to surrender. And this is a signal that was picked up, or actually it's a signal that was transferred. It talks a little bit about this U-234. This is obviously the day after it happened. It says, press representatives may be permitted to interview officers and men of German submarines that surrender. This was standard procedure. Any submarine that surrendered, the press could sit down and talk to till the cows come home. Okay? It says, this message only applies to submarines that surrender. It does not apply to other prisoners of war, and it does not apply to prisoners of U-234. They're making one exception. Out of all the U-boats that are out there, they're making one exception, U-234. Okay? Prisoners of U-234 must not be interviewed by press representatives. So right away we know there's something peculiar or strange about U-234. This is a couple of days later. It's from the Commander-in-Chief of Naval Operations. And it's to the Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet and the naval yard at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is where U-234 was brought in when it was surrendered to the USS Sutton, which is a destroyer. Okay, and this is just kind of reiterates what we just heard. Maintain prisoners of U-234 incommunicado and send them to Washington right quick because we want to interrogate these guys. Okay, so they knew there was something special about U-234. Now, excuse me, I just ate lunch. Part of what's really interesting about U-234 is U-234 was 3 times larger than the average German submarine. It was the only submarine of its size left. They'd only made a total of about 20 of these, and all of them had been sunk with 2 exceptions. One of them was U-219, which the Germans had turned over to the Japanese, and it was in the Pacific, and U-234. It was the only surviving U-boat of its size. This is received on May 15th. May 15th is the day that the destroyer Sutton actually boarded U-234, okay? They say on here, we're talking about U-234, talks about all the prisoners, and the captain says we got 7 naval officers. We have a Major General Ulrich Kessler and 2 Luftwaffe officers. Now the Luftwaffe is the Air Force. What's an Air Force general doing on a Navy submarine, right? Okay. We have 1 civilian engineer and another one that's ill on the sub, so there's civilians on this U-boat. We got 2 Japanese officers that killed themselves. So far, everything I've told you is part of the traditional history. Okay, people who study this and do theses and dissertations will vouch for everything I've said. There's books about it too. Okay, on U-234, 2 Japanese officers killed themselves before they surrendered. Now they were both of the samurai class. But when you board a submarine, pretty much in any military service, they're not going to let you carry weapons on the submarine. So they had to turn them all over to the captain. So they didn't have their weapons, so they took overdoses of luminol to kill themselves once they realized they weren't going to be able to complete their missions. And they were buried at sea just before the Sutton, the day before the Sutton boarded them. The sub has valuable cargo of plans, not only plans, but component parts to a lot of interesting technology. So there was something special about U-234. Now this is on May 23rd. So U-234 was boarded on the 15th. They brought it out of the Atlantic. It landed at Portsmouth Naval Yard in New Hampshire on May 19th. And this is from the Commander-in-Chief and Chief of Naval Operations to the Navy Yard at Portsmouth again. Says, desire, that you unload the U-boat. Be careful, make sure it's safe. And then everything you get, we want sent to, send a list of everything basically to Washington, D.C. because we think it's of important, that's vital to our prosecuting the Pacific War. Okay. Now they started looking at what they had on this U-boat, and I hope I'm not missing too much. I know you guys are kind of on a tight schedule, so if you have any questions or anything, if it's something that really you need to keep in context, raise your hand so I can help you in context, but otherwise write a note and we'll save it for the end. On here, this is a copy of the German manifest that was prepared when U-234 was being loaded. Okay? Down here, this is the 3rd page, about a little over halfway down, we have, in 10 cases, we have 560 kilograms of urine oxide. Okay? Well, what's that? I bet you don't know. This translation was done, if I remember right, this translation was done May 27th, if I remember correctly. This was the translation of the manifest we just saw into English, and right here it says 10 cases, 560 kilogram of uranium oxide. Now, like I said, everything I've told you is all part of the traditional history. There's books written about this. What the traditional history says, however, is that this uranium oxide, 1, was just natural uranium, it wasn't enriched. 2, that there's no proof that it went into the Manhattan Project, although, it's kind of interesting. I've been working on this for 12 years, and when I first started, when I'd been into it about 4 or 5 years, a producer who was doing a documentary on U-234 called me up and said, I heard you have some interesting, documentation about this U-boat. I said, yeah, and we conversed and I sent it to him. He had previously done a video about U-234 in which he interviewed Colonel Lonsdale, who was the head of the intelligence arm of the Manhattan Project. And Lonsdale in that video says, well, you know, the uranium came, but we don't know what happened to it. It may have gone into to Oak Ridge, but we're not sure. Well, when he was doing his second program, after he received this stuff, and when you watch the second one, I think it's called The Last U-Boat. You can see it sometimes, they still show it on the History Channel and stuff, and Lonsdale's in there. And actually the documents they show are actually copies of my documentation that I'm showing you here. They didn't even go to the archives, they just used mine, but just so you know. Anyway, they talked to Colonel Lonsdale in that one. He says, yeah, the uranium came, we were glad it came, we brought it into Oak Ridge. It was, you know, perfect timing, and he was all excited. So the story kind of changed as the evidence came out of what the reality was. Okay, so and the traditional story is still changing. Now, as I said, that translation was done on May 23rd. Okay, this is the cover page of an inventory that was done from what was the cargo that was on U-234. Okay. Now, let me tell you, on board U-234, besides the enriched uranium, I'm not going to tell you it was enriched yet, but besides the uranium, they also had plans and parts for a fully disassembled Messerschmitt 262, which was the first jet fighter used in combat by the Germans, by anybody. They had plans and parts for V-2 and V-4 rockets. They had plans and parts for electric torpedoes, which were the first to come around. They had actual fair, I guess, stock of infrared proximity fuses. They had, what else? They had something called the stratosphere plane, and there was also a fully, I should say not fully disassembled, but a component disassembled high altitude pressurized cockpit. Okay. And so when you kind of put those together, it looks like they had some pretty high-tech stuff on this U-boat. It was just jam-packed with all kinds of technology. Okay. Well, this is the cover page of that inventory of all the documents and parts and everything they took off that U-boat. That inventory is probably about that thick. Okay. Now, right here it says, I've checked with the red pencil, indicate any items that were shipped out through the present date. Okay, so it should have pretty much everything in it. I went through that inventory 4 times personally, and there is no mention of uranium in the inventory at all. It just disappeared, and that was by the 16th of June, so basically a little over 2 weeks later. Okay, the uranium was out of sight. On the 27th of May, again from Chief of Naval Operations to the Naval Yard at Portsmouth, we have this kind of accounting of things going on with U-234. And what's of real interest here, first of all, it talks about Lieutenant Pfaff. Lieutenant Pfaff was the second watch officer on U-234, and he was the one responsible for getting U-234 loaded up. Now, loading a U-boat is a lot more complicated than loading a regular ship. You have to balance a regular ship pretty carefully, but loading a U-boat, because they submerge and they're a lot more buoyant and they do a lot of weird stuff, is even more technical and more difficult. So you really have to understand what you have on board. So Pfaff understood what was on board. I don't know that he knew really what the significance of uranium was, but he knew he had uranium on board, and he told him it's loaded in gold-lined cylinders, and as long as the cylinders are not open, it can be handled like crude TNT. These containers should not be open, as substance will become sensitive and dangerous. This is part of the traditional history. You can look in the books about U-234, and they will talk about this document. But the interpretation of it has always been in terms of the traditional history, which says that the Germans had no capacity for enriching uranium, they weren't very successful in their nuclear efforts, and therefore this had to be natural uranium. I've taken this to no fewer than 6 physicists, some very big name, highly qualified physicists, including Dr. Delmar Bergen, who was, he's retired now, but he was the director of the Weapons Program Office at Los Alamos, and later the deputy director of the Theoretical Weapons Design Division. Gary Sandquist, who was an instructor of nuclear engineering at West Point. John Proctor, the department head of nuclear engineering at Texas A&M. Bernard Waring, who's the head of the J.J. Pickle Nuclear Research Center in Texas at the University of Texas. All of them have basically said the correct interpretation of this document, while it's not absolutely conclusive, this is far more probable to be enriched uranium because of the mention of being in gold-lined cylinders. Gold is, while not the best, is a good, it captures neutrons well. So as the uranium's emitting neutrons, it'll capture them. The cylindrical geography helps to keep criticality down. It talks about as long as they're handled like TNT. TNT, if you have a lot of TNT, rather than storing it in one big place, and if you accidentally detonate it, you have this catastrophic event, the practice is to section it off and keep it in separate, smaller quantities, so if part of it gets ignited, you only lose that part and you don't have a catastrophic event. You know, the physics are a little bit different, but the principle is the same. If you have, you know, several subcritical, if you have a supercritical amount of enriched uranium, you're going to want to keep it in subcritical volumes, right? And so this is, you know, indicates that that's what they're doing. What else? And then it talks about, you know, it'll be sensitive and dangerous if you open it. All of that, can anybody here imagine any of that being written, particularly during the war years, about natural uranium? How about enriched uranium? You know, this is the first evidence, and again, it's part of the traditional history. It's just been misinterpreted. They haven't ever had physicists look at it and say, this is what this means, you know. Now, it's true, you could take unenriched natural uranium and store it in gold-lined cylinders, and you could separate it into subcritical parts, but it's not going to be critical anyway, unless you have a mass that's about the size of the Earth. You know, it's like, it would be like storing Kool-Aid in a vintage wine cellar. You could do it, but would you? You know. So now this is one of the few non-primary documents that I'm going to show you, but it's important because it's the English version of a memoir written by a guy by the name of Wolfgang Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld was the chief radio operator on board U-234. Okay, he wrote his memoirs in German and in English. And they differ a little bit. He's a little more detailed in the German, but I use English because how many here speak German? I don't, so. Anyway, it's interesting. Down here he talks about two Japanese officers were to travel on U-234. Air Force General Genzo Shoji, sometimes they spell it with a J and sometimes with an S. I'm not sure how it's supposed to be pronounced. And Navy Captain Hideo Tominaga. Okay, and he goes on and he talks about, I saw these two officers seated on a crate on the fore casing, engaged in painting a description in black characters on the brown paper wrapping gummed around each of a number of containers of uniform size. He checked after the war, he checked the loading manifest, which we just saw, and realized that there were 10. Each case was a cube, enormously heavy. Once the inscription U-235 had been painted on the wrapping of a package, it was then carried over to the knot and put in the U-boat. So everybody, I don't know, maybe I'm assuming too much. Everybody here know the significance of U-235? That is the isotope of uranium that we enrich to get to weapons-grade uranium, right? Now he saw them actually painting U-235 on these packages of uranium. He went to the Japanese officers. He said, you know, what's this U-235 mean? And they said, well, this was supposed to, originally was scheduled to go to Japan on U-boat U-235, but they canceled that mission, so now we're doing it on U-234. Well, he had just sat there and watched them from a distance painting U-235 on it. I guess he didn't want to challenge them face to face, so he went to the captain. He said, "What's going on? Why are they, why are these say U-235?" The captain said, "Well, don't worry about it. Don't make any noise about it." So, for some reason, he didn't let that go. He went to the flotilla schedulers and he said, "Did U-235, was it ever scheduled to go to Japan?" And they said, "No, U-235 is only a school boat and it's never left the shores." And I actually tracked down a guy who did an extensive manuscript on the history of U-235, and he validated that. And in fact, U-235, the only time it ever went out on its first real mission, it was sunk accidentally by German patrol boats on its first mission, just barely out of harbor. That was right at the end of the war. So, we have a document that basically says the evidence is that it was enriched uranium in the U-boat, and we have an eyewitness that says that uranium was labeled U-235, which would mean that it was enriched uranium. Now, what happened to that uranium? This is the end of May, the 30th of May. We have this communication, again from Chief of Naval Operations to Portsmouth Naval Yard, and it's talking about U-234. Look, and he says, he's sending out Lieutenant Commander Carl B. Reese, Lieutenant Edward B. McDermott, and Major John E. Vance. CE stands for Corps of Engineers, USA stands for U.S. Army. And their job is to come out and unload U-234. Now, anybody here been in the military? Anybody here see anything that just looks a little weird about that? Would it be normal for a Navy operation to invite the Army in on something on this level and just say, "Hey, look what we found. Come help us figure out what it is"? They're pretty jealously guard that kind of stuff. I contend that there's no way that you'd have a guy from the Army on this Navy operation unless somebody at a pretty high level said, "This guy's coming in, you let him help you." Okay? Take a look at the date. This is the 30th of May. You remember that inventory was 16th of June, right? Okay. Anyway, so far, everything I've shown you, all the primary documentation I've shown you has come out of the archives for the U.S. Navy, out of National Archives for the U.S. Navy. This next document I'm going to show you is out of the archives for the Manhattan Project, specifically Oak Ridge and, well, Oak Ridge in general, Y-12 as we go. This is a transcript of a telephone conversation between two Manhattan Project intelligence officers, Major Traynor and Major Smith. There's a whole lot in here, and I always forget something, so raise your hand, or I'll try to remember everything. But I'm going to go through it in a little detail here. He says, "I've got shipment of captured material. Number one is captured. Okay, there are 39 drums, 70 wooden barrels. I haven't shown you, but on the manifest they talk about 30 drums and or barrels, and actually." They don't talk about it in those terms. They talk about 110 drums and barrels, or 109. The total is exactly the total we have here that was brought off of U-234. So it looks like we're talking about the same vehicle that we're taking this captured stuff off of. Okay. What I need is test and see what the concentration is and a set of recommendations as to disposal. I've just talked to Vance. Okay, does anybody recognize the name Vance? Vance was the Army guy in the Navy operation who's responsible for the captured material, right? Okay, that was the Navy archives. Here in Manhattan Project Archives, we have a Vance who's responsible for captured material. Okay, so we're going to go on. They're taking it off, putting it in the 73rd Street warehouse. In addition to that, I have about 80 cases of U powder. Okay, so we got 80 cases of uranium powder, and you're saying, but it was in 10 cases. I'll address that in a minute. Let me just kind of go through this and we'll come back to that. Okay, and if I don't, raise your hand and say, go back. Okay, Vance is handling all of that now. Can you do the testing and how quickly it can be done? All we know is that it ranges from 10 to 85%, and we want to know which and what. When I first read that last sentence in that paragraph, I thought, man, they're even telling us how much this stuff is enriched to, how much the uranium is enriched to. Okay? But as I read through it, he says, can you give what's in those cases? He says U powder. He talks again about Vance is taking care of the testing of that. The other stuff's something else. The other is water. He says we can take samples of each and analyze that. And I realize they're not talking about, the concentration isn't talking about the uranium. It's talking about the water. What about the water? That's weird. So I went back and I went through that inventory again. And in those bubbles and or barrels and drums, in those barrels and drums, they had 2 or 3 different kinds of things. Some of it was, every now and then I get a brain cramp. I can't remember. It's a fluid that would be used as a biological shield for radiation in a fluid form. It's like a, no, that's what I'm getting to. The part. The other stuff, man, it's benzyl cellulose, is that right? Anyway, I think that's right. Anyway, and then the other stuff was confidential, and in everything in that whole inventory, the only thing they wrote down as being confidential was the water. Well, the only thing that's missing is water, okay? And they just have these barrels that are confidential. I think the confidential stuff in the barrels was the water. Why would the water, what are they talking about, 10 to 85% of concentration in the water? Who said heavy water? Was that you? Heavy water. Does anybody know the Germans, the traditional history of the German effort to create an atomic bomb centers on the effort to create plutonium by creating a breeder reactor using heavy water as a modifier. They made a mistake in calculating the modifier characteristics of graphite, which we used, which was much more effective, and they came up with heavy water. So what they had on this U-boat was, in this 10 to 85% concentration, is talking about what the concentration of heavy water is in these barrels. So what they had on the U-boat was not only uranium, which I believe was enriched, which I think the evidence shows was enriched, but they also had the makings of a reactor as well, the German reactor. I want to go back just for a minute to, excuse me, to the 80 cases. You remember it was in 10 cases, and then there were, but the uranium was actually in gold-lined cylinders, right? If you take those 80 cases, if those 80 cases were actually the gold-lined cylinders that the uranium was actually in, which is what it was in contact with. Oh, the other good reason to use gold is because gold is very stable, and as you all know, uranium is very corrosive. And if it was enriched uranium, that would have corroded and contaminated the enriched uranium, and there would have been a lot of loss of enriched uranium to contamination because of the corrosion. So, at any rate, so if you have 560 kilograms and you divide it by 80 cases that you put it in, you get about 7.5 kilograms, which is just about half of what critical mass was for uranium at that time, what their calculation was. Their calculation was 15 kilograms for critical mass at that time. So there's another buffer saying we don't want to get so close with this uranium. We want to make sure everything stays subcritical. And as you know, pressure and water is a modifier. In a submarine, you can imagine what would have happened if they'd have had an accident and they didn't take some fairly extensive precautions. Now, so we just showed that the uranium was enriched uranium. We've just tracked it into the Manhattan Project. We want to say, well, what happened to it? This is a memo from Eric Jetty, who was the chief metallurgist, first in Chicago at the Met Lab and then later on at Los Alamos. And he's giving some estimates based on what they're getting now. And down here he says, at the present rate, we will have 10 kilos about February 7th and 15 kilos about May 1st. And this is in the end of December, okay? He's making a prediction based on how much enriched uranium he's getting at the time as to when they will have 15 kilos, which is critical mass, okay? So he's basically saying around May 1st we should have our first critical mass enough to make a bomb. This is two things. The one I just showed you, when I was showing that document at Los Alamos, a nice little senior citizen in the front row raised her hand. She said, "Oh, Eric Jetty, I had his son in my 4th grade class. He was such a nice boy." And I said, "Oh, good." Anyway, it's kind of strange to be standing there and have that kind of discussion with people who are really personally involved. And also, well, you'll see later, I'll have a document that talks about, it was a document Norris Bradbury wrote while I was doing this presentation in the Bradbury Science Museum at Los Alamos. So it's, you know, it's a little intimidating at times. Anyway, this is the other thing I was going to say. While I was there this last time, I called this the beta tube alloy trioxide report, and I was corrected. It's beta tuballoy. Okay, so if you don't know that, you do now. This is the beta tuballoy trioxide report, and this is basically a report of the uranium, enriched uranium that was coming out of the beta calutrons. Okay, I talked to Clarence Larson twice on the phone specifically about this report and other things, but specifically about this report to make sure I understand it. And he helped me understand what the you know, what we're talking about in terms of the batch number, the grams oxide analysis factor, grams RT, assay factor, and the grams RX. And I'll cover that in a minute. But this is just the first page. I just use it to show you I have it. I have the entire document, which is several pages. This is actually the first page of 1945. I have from May of 1944 when they first started production through to the end of 44 and then all of 45. I took those documents and I kind of graphed them. I didn't kind of graph, well, for you guys, I'm not a technician, so I guess it is kind of a graph. For somebody who's really good at it, they'd probably do a better graph than this. But what we have here is that the vertical scale is kilograms, the horizontal scale is time, and this dotted line right here is the bomb size as reported by Robert Serber, who wrote the Los Alamos Primer, and just maybe a decade ago it was republished with notes by him, current notes by him as to what was going on and why he did what he did. And he reveals in there that the actual size of the uranium bomb, which was one dropped on Hiroshima, was 50 kilograms. I'm sorry. Oh, I should be looking back and, yeah. Okay, so this is just 1944, and I put it on there to show you I have it. And then 1945 is the interesting one. And what I've done is I've graphed, kind of forget these lines down here. These are ones I was working out, looking at some, you know, theories as to what could have happened before I understood what did happen. Okay. The top line here is what came out of the calutrons altogether, including U-238, U-235, and any other contaminants that were in the process. The middle line represents all of the uranium, both U-238 and U-235. The bottom line represents how much of that was U-235. Okay? Excuse me. And so, and we have it, I'm going to put this back on for just a second because I want to remind you, Jetty said on December 28th that at the rate they were going, they would have 15 kilograms by the 1st of May, okay? But if you look here, and they were already, by that time, if you remember, they had all 5 of the alpha buildings, all 5 of the alpha buildings, all 4 of the beta buildings, all of those calutrons were running at that time. So they were basically in full process, and that's how they ran till the end of the war. Is there anybody here that wants to correct me on that and knows better than that? For my research, that's what happened, okay? So he knows what he's getting, and he's saying right here at the end that he's going to have 15 kilograms at the rate he's receiving it, but 15 kilograms is right here. He has way more than that, or he should have, okay? But he doesn't. He's not getting it, okay? The problem I had, there was this whole, when I made this graph, I could have kicked myself for a long time, because what I did is I looked at this and it says, well, you know, the bomb size was 50 kilograms, and we were definitely to 50 kilograms by the time they fabricated the bomb, and so I must be wrong. By the time I got to this point, I've been doing this research for 6 years, and I was just like, I can't be wrong. But I was wrong. It's here in the documented proof, and I promised myself, you know, Carter, whatever you do, no matter how invested you get in this, the important thing is to find the truth. And if you find out you're wrong, you got to walk away. And I did just that. When I got to this, my wife will tell you, she was here last time, she vouched for this. I left all this stuff in my study, and I had tens of thousands of documents just spread out my study, boxes and boxes, and I just left it there for 9 months. I wouldn't go in my study. I didn't work on this because I just didn't know where to go or what to do. And finally my wife came to me and she says, you know, the study belongs to the whole family, and you kind of taking it over and not doing anything in there. You need to do something. So I thought, yeah, she's right. So I thought, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through every single document I have. Now, when you do research like this, I was doing this on my own time. I was working a full-time job and doing this with my own money on my own time. So I can't afford to go and spend months in the archives and take out each document and read it and try and see how it relates to other ones and assess it. My strategy was to go in, and when I present this at universities, the history professors always go, yeah, that's what's going on. You go in, you find a file from the findings list that looks like it might be relevant, you take it to the Xerox and you go swoosh, and you Xerox everything in that file or in that box. So I've got, like I said, tens of thousands of documents. A lot of them don't even relate when I found out, but a lot of them did. So I thought, at that point, when she called me on it, I said, okay, I'm going to go through all those documents, every document I have, and if nothing bounces out of it, I'm throwing it all away and walking away from this thing and getting my life back. So I started going through those documents again. By this time, 6 years, I'm not a scientist, and so when I first started pulling these documents, unless they were really basic, I didn't understand what I was looking at in a lot of cases. But 6 years later, I had a better understanding of what I was looking at. So I'm going through my documents, and I pull this out. And I still, when I read this, to this day, I still get goosebumps because this is an important document and it's conclusive proof that the traditional history is wrong. Okay? This is in March, middle of March of 1944. It's to J. Robert Oppenheimer from Samuel K. Allison. It says, irradiated enriched sample, and that's as far as I read, and I knew I had it. Okay? Does anybody know what the traditional history says about when reactors used enriched uranium as a fuel? When they even started experimenting? Oh, I meant to get one. I'm sorry? It was after the war. According to the traditional history, there was no experimentation done until after the war of enriched uranium in a reactor until after the war, and there was no cranking up the Hanford reactors to enriched level, no actual productive use of them until after the end of until the beginning of the new year, 1946. Okay, so this conclusively proves that the traditional history is wrong, and it's even in. I don't know if you still have the same brochure you had, but when I was here about 5 years ago, there's a brochure, and it actually. I want to say Philip Abelson, but that's not. Alvin Weinberg, who was at one time the director here after the war, actually wrote a section in there, and it talks about how after the war they started experimenting. Well, I can show you here that it was in the middle of the war that they were already experimenting with enriched uranium in their reactors.
How did they make using that word enriched from the irradiated slugs, meaning plutonium?
It doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, the irradiated enriched means they've
Enriched could mean the plutonium from the natural uranium slugs that were put in the pile over here. You could also
enriched plutonium?
Well, they're using the word enriched, meaning they were making plutonium out of it. That was their job over there in the pile, was to separate out the gram quantities of plutonium. And the term enriched could be applied to that the slugs were enriched, they were transmuted into plutonium.
Okay, that's the first time I've ever had that, but I have some more documents in here, and I think that'll still cover it, and you'll see that my story still holds. But that's the first time anybody's ever challenged that. Everybody that I've talked to so far, both at Los Alamos and here and at the National Atomic Museum, have all understood that to mean enriched uranium.
To the Clinton pile.
Right.
Isn't that X10?
That's X10. That's the Clinton pile. Right. But what I say this means is that they're using enriched uranium to fuel the Clinton pile. They're experimenting with enriched uranium in the Clinton pile because it was a pilot pile. That's what they used it for, to understand whether using enriched uranium in the pile will increase the plutonium output. Okay? Okay. This is a backup letter that Samuel Allison sent. He said, I'm sending a separate package for 7 milligrams of tubuloy 3-oxide 8. So I think this, unless there's a capital T in the periodic chart, which I don't believe there is, I believe they're using that T as a symbol for tubuloy, which would be uranium. Okay? So they're talking about enriched uranium, this part of the sample which is exposed at X, which would be X10 or Oak Ridge. Okay? So this is a backup letter stating, I believe more specifically, that they're talking about enriched uranium. Okay? Here's some more. I'm glad I brought these. I've thought several times I've got too many of these documents putting this in here, but I'm glad I have them here now. Okay? Here's one. Again, it's to Oppenheimer and Robert Bacher. Anybody know who Robert Bacher was? My understanding from my research is Robert Bacher was basically the guy who was the overall manager of the plutonium bomb project. Is that an accurate assessment? That's what I've said. Yeah, he was, but he was.
Arthur Compton was in charge of the plutonium side.
But he on the managerial kind of level. Okay, I think Compton was more on the scientific side, but Bacher was more on the. Okay, he would like to emphasize this again from Allison. 3 grams total of enriched oxide. Okay, so I think we're talking uranium. You think we're talking plutonium? Okay. He's somewhere in one of these he says he'd like to take it from the alpha, so I think that would tell us that it is uranium. Is this the one? Well, he talks about, yeah, he's talking about the grams of total amount, not the 25 content. Okay, 25, right, is the code name for U-235, which is enriched uranium. Okay? It's not okay, but I'm running out of time.
Yeah.
Process, okay? I think we're still talking about enriched uranium. I think that document shows that. And here, this is Allison giving him a little more background. Again, he's talking about 3 grams of enriched material. Oh, I know. I think I know where the alpha. Period. That's when they. This is a telex, a teletype, and so when they do that, they always put periods for the period. Okay. Yeah. Here's what I'm looking for. This has gone up a level. Okay. Oppenheimer's writing to Groves, and he's basically saying here, Allison's requesting a half a gram. Now he's talking in terms of just the U-35 instead of the full amount, okay, of X from Y12 alpha product, okay? So this document to me says he's talking specifically about enriched uranium. Okay, he says we're doing it for experimental. We don't have enough in experimental stocks. I'd like to take it out of the production stocks. I'm okay with doing it, but I want your blessing first. Okay, I don't know what Grove's response was. I couldn't find it, but I think that shows that enriched uranium was being used to fuel, at least experimentally, to fuel the Clinton reactor to see what kind of successes they'd have producing plutonium. Because
how was it enriched?
I'm sorry?
How was it enriched? How was the uranium enriched?
It was enriched at Y12.
Oh, okay.
What I'm saying,
Then was used
and then was used, yeah, they were saying, okay, probably a lot of you know this, but during the war, there's 2 ways to build a bomb, an enriched uranium bomb and a plutonium bomb. Enriching uranium takes a long time. They found out once they realized they could make a bomb from plutonium, they realized they could make it faster, cheaper, and it'd be far more 3 times more explosive. And so plutonium became the priority. They said, we want to make a plutonium bomb, and that's what they focused on. All right? So I think they were enriching uranium. At that time, they thought 15 kilograms was what they would need for one bomb. And so they knew they were going to be on track for that, so they said, okay, let's put the other half and stick it in. Once they had done the experiments in mid-44 and shown that using enriched uranium in a reactor is going to help them make a lot more plutonium, that they decided to go ahead and start putting a lot of that enriched uranium into plutonium. And that's the reason I kept hanging on during those 9 months is I couldn't make sense of two things. Jetty's memo that said we'll have 15 kilograms when it was obvious they already were on track to have far more than that. And on April 12th, FDR died. This is in Richard Rhodes's book, The Making the Atomic Bomb. On April 12th, Franklin Roosevelt died. On that same day, Oppenheimer was informed that they finally had achieved enriching a volume that equaled critical mass here at Y12. Okay? They were pretty excited about that. Between the day that FDR died and his funeral services on April 16th, they came back to Oppenheimer and said, guess what? We do have critical mass, but we've realized in order for this bomb to have the size and effectiveness to be a strategic weapon at the level of the investment we've made, we need to use 3 times critical mass. And that's where we get the 50 kilograms that Serber says was the actual size of the bomb. And it's pretty much part of the traditional history that's when, the Manhattan Project kind of went into panic at that time because they were going to be short the amount of uranium they had at the bomb. The other part of it is, and it's unspoken, but they would have been close to having it had they not been putting it, according to the records here, had they not been putting it in the plutonium bomb. That was kind of okay because the plutonium bomb was still a good thing and they were making all kinds of plutonium, right? So they were going to be okay. This is one last document. I want to point out that this is on July 28th. It's too late to have been used in the bombs or to have been part of the bombs used in the war. But still, it's important because it's to Cyril Smith, who was a metallurgist who worked for Eric Jetty on both the uranium and plutonium bomb, although he is more focused on the plutonium bomb. Joseph Kennedy, one of the co-discoverers of plutonium, Samuel K. Allison and Robert F. Bacher, all 3 of the last gentlemen were focused on a plutonium bomb. It's from Robert Oppenheimer, and it says, I have a schedule of U-235 deliveries in the next few weeks. They do not include the material now on hand. So U-235 is automatically enriched, right? And it's going to the key guys from the plutonium bomb, and it's production. We're not talking grams, we're talking about multi-kilogram quantities of enriched uranium going to the plutonium bomb program. Okay? So what I'm saying, my theory is, based on the evidence, that while we were having Y12 was obviously, from what I showed you, having great success enriching uranium, comparatively, it was being separated out and going into the plutonium bomb. Now that would have been fine if the plutonium bomb would have been workable, but anybody who's done a little bit of history in here knows we were having a serious problem triggering the plutonium bomb. The uranium bomb, you just put a high velocity, you put one slug in a high velocity cannon and shoot it into another slug. They're both subcritical. When they come together, they're critical. In a high velocity cannon, the assembly is fast enough, you reach critical mass, it explodes. They didn't even test that. They were that confident it was going to work, and that's what we dropped on Hiroshima. The plutonium bomb ignites, it has to be assembled way faster than that, and I was using the figure 1/300,000th of a second. Let me back up just a second. I hope I have time. the plutonium bomb was a hollow sphere of plutonium about the size of a small orange, wrapped in 6 feet of high explosives that was scientifically engineered to implode that sphere to where it would come to critical mass. They used 32 detonators, and they actually put redundant detonators on it, so 64 to fire. They had to fire all those detonators off within, I was saying 1/3000th of a second. Well, Del Bergen, he looked at me and he said, that's way off. That's, you know, it was way shorter time than that in order to get it right. And even Luis Alvarez in his book, who was the guy, the hero who supposedly solved this problem, said that in their experiments, they had, and I can't even remember the term he used, but it was like a macromillimeter or something like that. All the shock waves had to happen within a macromillimeter, and the closest they could get was 22 feet. So they were way, way off, okay, using mechanical means. Well, the next thing I want to show you, we're going to go back to U-234 now. I'm building another pile again. This is on May 24th. Jack Alberti was the head of the naval intelligence guys who were interrogating the passengers and prisoners that came off of U-234. Down here he says the packages for Dr. Schliche, one of the passengers, contain, they're marked, Tony, let's see, infrared fuses which are in some of these packets. He warns they must be handled with utmost care, etc. So we have infrared fuses on this U-boat. Now that was, remember I told you that was May 24th. The very next day, May 25th, Chief of Naval Operations to New York Naval Yard at Portsmouth. He says, I'm sending these 2 pilots, are flying a guy by the name of Dr. Schliche, POW, from Anacostia up to pick up those proximity fuses. Okay? Now, out of all the technology I told you was on U-234, why do you think they made a special attempt to go back just to pick up those proximity fuses the day after they found out about them? What's that?
Proximity fuses were one of the inventions during the
Everything on that U-boat was an invention during the war. Why didn't they go get everything? It's obviously handwritten English translation of a German document that was in Schliche's care. Okay? It says investigation of the usability of ultraviolet invisible light for transmitting messages or commands, and particularly for the remote ignition of warhead fuses. When you read further into this report, it also it references another report that they did about the use of infrared for the ignition of warhead fuses. Okay, they were doing 2 reports, 2 experiment studies on ultraviolet and infrared light to see which would be best for using for igniting warhead fuses. And they both had pros and cons. There's no conclusion as to which would be best from anything that I could see. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try and speed up a little bit here. This is a document. Dr. Schliche was asked to speak at Office of Naval Intelligence, or somewhere in the Navy Department. It talks about, this is the introduction. He says, after Dr. Schliche completes his lecture, you're going to ask questions, but basically he says down here, after the lecture, Mr. Alvarez will sit at the table, and the person who wishes to ask a question is asked to come forward. Okay, so we have a Mr. Alvarez who's basically kind of a handler or somehow connected with Dr. Schliche in this context. This is the last page of a 3-page letter from Ulrich Kessler, who was the German Luftwaffe general who was on U-234. Okay, he talks about, in here, he talks about Commander Alvarez. A bunch of stuff was taken from him and he never saw it, and he's trying to get it back, and he's basically saying Commander Alvarez saw this stuff. He identifies him twice as Commander Alvarez. Okay, he'll know where this, or at least he witnessed that he had it. This is a letter actually written in the late 1980s to a guy, Harry Cooper, who is the head of Shark Hunters, which is a association of historians that study the history of submarines, U-boats, and that kind of stuff. And this is from Captain Failer, the captain of the U-boat. He identifies a light commander, Lieutenant Commander Alvarez also, and then he says probably not his real name, also as being his interrogator in relation to U-234. Okay, so we have an Alvarez all over U-234 and the people there. And so I thought, well, who is this Alvarez? Because I couldn't find in any of the records, the intelligence reports, I couldn't find anything that was signed or indicated that there was an Alvarez doing any interviewing or interrogations by any of these people. It didn't show up. So I thought, well, who is Alvarez? So I got into the Register of Commissioned and Warrant Officers for the Navy and Marines. They put that out on, this one's for 1943. They put it out every other year. So that one's 1943. I also looked at 1945. Neither one of them had, as you can see from this, an officer in the Navy at the time by the name of Alvarez, which if it was in here should be right in here. Now it's well known, Groves even admits in his book, Now It Can Be Told, that in order to get the scientists from the Manhattan Project and the military to work together, he would give scientists rank insignias, uniforms, you know, the whole 10 yards, so that they could go in and work with the military when they needed to. And I believe that's exactly what happened. I think that that Alvarez, when they knew they had that U-boat coming in and it had atomic products on it, they needed somebody who was a high level, could be trusted, but who would know, who could understand what was useful on that U-boat and assess it. And I believe Alvarez is
Alvarez, an understudy of Lawrence.
He was more an understudy of Oppenheimer.
E.O. Lawrence, who was in charge of all of this, and he was one of his students. Is that the same outfit?
Luis Alvarez? Yeah. He was, I don't know if he was a student of Lawrence. I know he was a friend of Oppenheimer's and an understudy of Oppenheimer as well. They weren't friends? Well, that's different. I guess I'll have to reread my roads, but my yeah, we're running out of time. I'm sorry. Okay. This is April 18th, 2 months, May, June, July, 3 months before the Trinity shot. Norris Bradbury, he's saying in here, we've actually tested, we wanted to test 300, but we're going to have a lot smaller group of tests on the detonators. There's more than a bare possibility that detonators will be unsatisfactory. They knew that this is 3 months before they were having problems with the detonators. We know as far back as October of '44, they had recognized the detonators, trying to get that simultaneity of the detonation of the plutonium bomb was just killing them. And so Oppenheimer himself appointed a three-man committee to solve that problem, and the first one on the list is Luis Alvarez. Okay? He's the guy who's basically charged with figuring it out. Okay? Obviously, if you haven't got my drift from this, I believe that Luis Alvarez was on U-234, found out about those infrared proximity fuses, took him back. We know that in the last week before the Trinity shot, and also on the island of Trinity, I've talked personally with a guy by the name of Harlow Russ, who is one of the guys who assembled the plutonium bomb on Trinity. He's written a book called Project Alberta. He talks about it. In the last week prior to the shot and the bomb being done, they made modifications to the plutonium bomb where they installed what they called detonator chimneys, which I don't know what they were. I talked to him, and it sounds like they were some kind of passage between the detonators that allowed, you know, a chimney allows passage of something in it. Well, I believe what happened is they made those last-minute modifications so that they could put those infrared fuses in, because if they could get one infrared fuse to fire, they could get all of them to fire at the speed of light, and that solved their simultaneity problem. Okay, Luis Alvarez is the guy who's given the credit for solving this problem, and I believe that this is how he did it. One last shot, and then I'm done. I'm sorry, I'm a few minutes over. This is taken out of the New York Times, August 27th of 1945. There was a virtually identical article. The word's a little different, but the coverage is the same. In the London Times, it says a 17-minute oversea rocket plane among Germany's war secrets. So whether that was that stratosphere plane we were talking about or what, and whether, you know, from here, everything I've told, you know, I speculate for the fun of it, but when I speculate, please don't say Hydrick believes such and such. All I believe is that I've got this evidence and here's what it is. But it's interesting, you know, you can say, okay, if that was a platform for delivering a bomb and the components for a bomb were there, what would have happened? That's my story. I'm sticking to it. Anybody who needs to run away because lunch is over, I understand. I won't be offended. Anybody who wants to stay and chew on me, I'll stay till the cows come home. Thank you. Oh, I do have a few books. I'm sorry, when I was at the National Atomic Museum, they had sold out all theirs, so they bought a bunch of mine, and so I've got like 7 or 8 left. If you want one, we can do it. If I don't have enough, we can put your name on a list, and I'll send them to Mick or Ray, and we can get them to you. I'll sign them, whatever you want to do. All right. Thank you.